Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. This week, we're going to follow the remarkable life of one of the robber barons of the Gilded Age back in the late 1800s, Big Jim or Diamond Jim Fisk. Take your pick. The native Vermonter made his fortune in Boston, Washington, and New York City, and just wait until you hear the mind-boggling financial schemes he pulled off along the way. Now, here to tell us his memorable story is Leslie Landrigan. Leslie is a former journalist. She co-founded with her husband, also a former journalist, the New England Historical Society. She's a great storyteller, and this is one heck of a great story to tell. This week's trivia question: what was the incredible thing that Connecticut State Comptroller Nicholas Staub did with a padlock in the state capitol in the late 1800s? We'll stick around after the main program. We'll have the answer, and then you'll know the topic for next week's show. This week, we're focusing on one of the notorious robber barons of the Gilded Age in the United States. Now, that's a period of time that was after the Civil War ended in 1865 and lasted up until 1900. It's when financial swindlers kind of ran rampant and elected officials and judges were routinely on the take and bribed and allowed those robbers to get away with many of their misdeeds. Well, Jim Fisk was born in 1835 in the town that's literally the furthest southwest corner of Vermont. It borders New York State on the west and Massachusetts on the south. Jim, who would go on to be known by various monikers, including Big Jim and Diamond Jim, didn't learn about life in a textbook. He dropped out of school at the ripe old age of 12 and decided to develop street smarts to propel him through the rest of his life. Now, his dad was one of the famous Yankee peddlers, one of those guys who carried goods for sale in a horse and wagon in a door-to-door fashion. His coverage area went into Connecticut and also covered New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Jim helped his dad in his business from his earliest teenage years, and then he got kind of enamored by the circus, which passed through town when Jim was 15, so he ran off with the circus for 3 years and finally returned home to his dad's peddler business when he turned 18. He would later refer to that period of time in his life as the happiest days of his life. We're going to pick up the story with former journalist and the co-founder of the New England Historical Society, Leslie Landrigan. So Leslie, he finally leaves the circus and comes back to his hometown at age 18. His dad's peddler business is still going, and he brings some circus ideas back to help him kind of promote the business. Tell us about that.
Well, he loved anything gaudy and colorful and attention-grabbing. So he painted the peddlers' wagons bright colors, and he got 4 white horses to draw the wagons, and drove all around New England and was so successful. I think in the end he had 4 wagons. He would get goods on consignment from Jordan Marsh. And he always prided himself, even though he was a robber baron, he never sold shoddy goods. He always sold good quality products. He was quite successful at that, and he learned a lot.
Now, I've heard it described that he said that those were the happiest years of his life, and there's one great quote attributed to him: there wasn't no man that could throw dirt on Jim Fisk. He had a reputation and everything else. So at age 19, he marries somebody who is, I guess, 4 years his junior. This is Lucy Moore. Tell me about Lucy. What do we know about her?
We don't know a whole lot about her. We know that he loved her tenderly, but not exclusively. She was a Vermont girl. When he went on to Boston, Washington, New York to make his fortunes, she was happy to stay behind in Boston with her female companion. They apparently got along quite well, and he visited her quite a lot and, gave her quite a lot of things. I just found out, by the way, that they apparently had a son called Sabin, but very little is known about him.
Interesting. I was going to ask you about that. Well, that's good to know, but we don't know what happened to Sabin, so we'll leave that one there. But he went, as you said, he went to Boston. And Jordan Marsh, who had been giving him goods on consignment, actually gave him a shot in the store, and that didn't go too well, did it?
He failed miserably. He was loud. He wore checked suits. He probably came across as a rube. and they were about to let him go. But Jim Fisk always kind of had a sense of what was going on in the world. And he knew that the Civil War was coming, and he knew that the US government was going to need to outfit an army. And he also knew that even Jordan had a warehouse full of blankets that he couldn't sell. So when Eben said, this really isn't working, Jim, he said, give me a chance. Just let me do my thing, but don't pay too much attention to my expense account. So that's how he ended up at the Willard Hotel in Washington.
Now, he set himself up pretty well there to entertain some of the government muckety-mucks, right? He had a bar and a buffet?
Yeah. The first thing he did was find out the fanciest hotel in Washington, which was the Willard, which was very near the White House. And this was his shtick. He did this throughout his life. He set up a hotel room. He had a 24-hour bar going, cigars, a buffet, probably women. And he never mentioned blankets. The subject kind of came up that the Union Army was in desperate need of blankets. And he just happened to have a warehouse full of them and managed to sell them. Now, he also may have spread a little money around the, people who were responsible for buying blankets, but that's how he got his start.
Now, while he was there, he realized there was a federal law during the Civil War that banned any imports to the North from the South of the South's big product of cotton, because they wanted to cut off any revenue supply. But he got around that, didn't he?
He did. Well, there was also the Union blockade, which made it very difficult to ship cotton to Britain or the United States. And, I think one thing that's important to understand is that cotton textiles were the biggest industry in the United States then. They were like Standard Oil. They were huge. And to cut off the cotton would be like cutting off Standard Oil's supply of gasoline. It would have been devastating, but he managed, with his network of friends and family, he managed to fan out across the South and buy contraband, illegal cotton, basically, and smuggle it north.
And I hear he may have spread some money around to get that done, too?
That was his MO. He did that a lot. He was an interesting character. He was likable. He was curious. He was able to do this, I think, because of his experience traveling around as a peddler, just getting to know people, getting to understand people. He made a fortune with the cotton smuggling.
But you bring up a good point that he was focused on something that was number one in the country, right? Cotton for textiles.
Right. And the Union Army desperately needed, uniforms, haversacks, tents, blankets. There was just an enormous need for textiles.
Once the Civil War was over, though, that whole business of selling to the government wasn't going to be nearly as lucrative. So he heads off to New York City and he becomes a stockbroker, and he's investing in what a lot of the successful Wall Street folks did at the time, which was investing in railroads, steamships, communications, things like telegraphs and that sort of thing. Those were the growing technologies like big tech is today. Now, he teamed up with a couple of people who kind of shared his view of maybe we don't always have to be ethical, maybe we can be unscrupulous, maybe they didn't like to use the word corrupt about themselves. But Jay Gould and Daniel Drew, tell me about those guys.
Daniel Drew started out as a cattle drover. Before delivering the cows to the cattle to market, he would not give them water for a while, and then they would be so thirsty they'd drink a ton of water. So that meant that when the cattle came to the market, they weighed more than they would have otherwise. And Daniel Drew took that concept to the stock market, where the expression watering stock came from. They would just issue tons and tons of shares of stock for a company for various nefarious reasons. But Daniel Drew was the one who started that. Jim Fisk was a very smart guy. So was Jay Gould, but Jay Gould was not flamboyant. He was more ruthless and focused on business. Jim Fisk, I think, he loved the game. He loved the show. If he lost a lot of money, he'd just sort of shrug and say, well, I'll get it back, whatever. But Jay Gould really liked money. And I mean, the three of them were pretty ruthless. I think Fisk was probably the least ruthless of them all.
Now, when you hear the following sentence, it almost seems incredible that Jay Gould and Jim Fisk essentially took over the Erie Railroad from Cornelius Vanderbilt and ended up with $100 million in profit, which in those days was probably $1 billion today. I'm not sure, but tell me that story.
That is a tough story to untangle because there were so many financial machinations going on. The big story, I guess, the big picture is that Cornelius Vanderbilt owned the New York Central Railroad, which was a big railroad. Well, Drew was a director of the Erie Railroad, and basically through stock manipulation, Fisk and Gould managed to take over the Erie Railroad. Cornelius Vanderbilt was trying to buy it, and they illegally issued a ton of stock that Cornelius Vanderbilt bought. And Vanderbilt got a judge to order them arrested for fraud. And Gould and Fisk's mistress took $6 million in cash and the Erie Railroad's books, and they boarded a ferry to New Jersey, and they moved the company headquarters to New Jersey, where New York could not arrest them or, take them into custody.
That's a great story. And I understand that later, if I have the story right, he bribed lawmakers in Albany so they could come back to New York.
Yes, he did. Actually, the lawmakers in Albany were up for auction. They would apparently accept $75,000 from Vanderbilt, and then they'd accept $100,000 from Fisk and Gould, and they'd vote with Gould and Fisk. So essentially, yeah, they bribed the legislature. They were also in bed with Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed, so they could get a lot of what they wanted through the courts.
Now, the other incredible thing, Jim Fisk now, at age 34, he and Gould go to the White House and convince Ulysses Grant to let them use his name in a scheme to try and corner the gold market, and that didn't turn out too well, did it?
No, it didn't. They wanted to corner the gold market because they wanted to weaken the dollar, because the weakened dollar meant more agricultural products could be transported on the Erie Railroad. So weak dollar was good for Erie. So they tried to corner the market. The government routinely, like the Treasury, would sell X amount of gold every month. And they persuaded Grant to not do that. They were very close to cornering the gold market when Grant saw what was happening and said, you got to release more gold into the system, which they did. And the price of gold crashed and it was all over. And I think Grant was later exonerated. He was just kind of a dupe in the whole thing. I mean, he was a military guy. What did he know about finance?
This was just amazing. And they ended up walking away with $11 million while everybody else lost their shirt. But the thing that kind of kept Jim Fisk in good graces, right? He's in his 30s now. He's just fabulously wealthy. And even though he's referred to as a robber baron, he also helped the needy, right? And he patronized the arts. Tell us about that side of Jim Fisk.
He did. Yeah. Anybody who came into his office would get a handout. He'd first check. He'd have the company detective make sure that the widow really was a widow and really was penniless. One day, a humpback kid came into his office and said he was having trouble selling newspapers. So Jim Fisk took him around to various places and finally got someone to agree to let the kid sell newspapers there, gave him money. He bought an opera house that was struggling, and it was a gaudy building, but he moved the railroad offices into it. One of the first things he did was meet with the police captain in charge of the district and said, hey, you probably know, the widows or the poor people who could really be helped by a barrel of flour or coal. So let me know. And so the police chief did that. He, gave him names, and Jim Fisk would send him a barrel of coal and a barrel of flour. My favorite thing about him was the 9th Regiment. I guess it was called the National Guard, the Ninth Infantry Regiment of New York, was they had crappy uniforms and their membership was dwindling. And they went to Jim Fisk and said, "Hey, how would you like to be a colonel in our regiment?" And this is a guy who escaped the draft during the Civil War, but he loved military stuff. And so he had this very gaudy uniform made, and he spent all this money and had a blast being a colonel, and insisted on people calling him colonel, even though it was just, it was like a banana republic general. But he was much loved by his regiment.
I love it. Speaking of love, he fell in love with this woman, Josie Mansfield, who I guess he was introduced to her at what's been described as the notorious Manhattan bordello of Annie Wood. Tell us that story.
Yeah, he liked the demi-monde. He hung out in gambling houses and bordellos and things like that. And there was a young actress. She was plump, and I guess she fit the definition of beauty of 1872. And she set her sights on Jim Fisk, and she went to Ann Fields and said, "Can you get me an introduction?" And she did. And Josie sounds like just a very accomplished courtesan. She just asked Mr. Fisk, Colonel Fisk, for a loan of $50 so that she could get started acting. And he said, "Well, let's meet someplace else." And one thing led to another, and he eventually installed her in a 4-story brownstone with servants and so forth on 23rd Street near the Opera House. And they called her the Cleopatra of 23rd Street because she lived so lavishly.
Now, he did not, though, really take her out to the same places that he went to, like Delmonico Steakhouse and that sort of place.
No. Now, he kept her under wraps. She was kind of stuck at home. I think he would come home every night. That was his home. And, he'd be with her and, flop himself down in an armchair. And she was young and, I think probably got a little sick of it.
And so maybe that's the reason why when he introduces one of his business associates named Ned Stokes to her, what happened then?
Well, Ned fell in love with Josie. Josie fell in love with Ned. And according to the court testimony, Ned's court testimony later on, he just visited her maybe 3 or 4 times a week, but he was never alone in the room with her, which absolutely nobody believed. So Josie starts to get anxious, and Jim Fisk has said to her, "I've made investments for you, and they're worth $20,000 now." So she sent him a letter saying, I really feel better if I could get my hands on that $20,000, although she didn't put it so bluntly. And Jim Fisk realized she was dumping him for Ned. So from then on, things kind of spiraled.
And when you say from then on, let's fast forward to January 6th, 1872, and Big Jim Fisk is going to visit, as I heard it, a family friend at the no longer in service Grand Central Hotel on Broadway, and he's walking up some stairs. What happened then?
He walks up the stairs, and Ned Stokes happens to be on the 2nd floor. He sees Jim Fisk, and he shoots him twice. Jim Fisk falls. Ned Stokes drops the gun and walks away. Suddenly, someone said, "Hey, that's the guy, that's the guy." So Ned Stokes is apprehended, and Jim Fisk is taken to a house where he's laid out on a bed, and he's bleeding heavily. The doctors realize it's probably a mortal wound. And Ned is brought to him, and the police say to Jim Fisk, "Is that the man who shot you?" And Jim Fisk says, "Yeah." And then he dies the next day.
Wow. And Jay Gould and Boss Tweed were by his side. Did I get that right?
Yes, they were. They were definitely by his side. And I think Jay Gould was the executor of his estate.
So Stokes gets identified clearly. Some people saw him. It was what I think you and I, as former journalists, would say a kind of open shut case. At least it seems so on the surface. But he ended up having to go through 3 trials, didn't he?
Yes, the first trial was a hung jury. What he said was that he feared for his life, that Jim Fisk had tried to ruin him. He had threatened him and had been ruthless toward some of his other enemies. Ned thought that Jim Fisk had a gun and thought he was going to shoot him, and so he fired first. Second jury said, yeah, death penalty. Yeah, he's guilty. And he appealed, got another trial, and was found guilty of manslaughter and got 6 years in prison, served 4, and then died in a flop house.
Diamond Jim Fisk was just 37 years old when he was murdered. Josie passed away years after Ned Stokes in Paris, France, where she had managed to move thanks to the investment that Big Jim had made for her. And Lucy Moore, Big Jim's wife, well, she got very little from her husband's estate after he died. Much of it had already been depleted. But she did receive financial assistance from Jay Gould and his wife, that is, until Mrs. Gould died, at which time the help ended. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path. Despite Jim Fisk's philandering, he and his wife are buried together in their hometown of Brattleboro, Vermont. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Leslie Landergan, former journalist and co-founder of the New England Historical Society. She co-founded that along with her husband, who is also a former journalist. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, what was the incredible thing that Connecticut State Comptroller Nicholas Staub did with a padlock in the state capitol in the late 1800s? Well, the answer? He locked the governor out of the governor's own office. Well, next week on Amazing Tales, there is a lot more to this story than meets the eye, and we're going to have the current state comptroller, Sean Scanlon, here to tell us the facts of this unusual case. Amazing Tales from Off the Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.